As we turn our attention to the livestock market, we're focusing on the cattle industry this week. We were joined earlier in the week by Oklahoma State University livestock marketing specialist Derrell. The U.S. Department of Agriculture recently released the March Cattle on Feed report. We began the discussion with Derrell by breaking down some of those numbers.
You know, this cattle on feed report had a really big placement number. It wasn't out of the range of expectations. There were some analysts that thought it could be this big. It was higher than the average expectation. So we came in about 9% above a year ago on placements. The marketing's number was about 5% above a year ago. And so we're coming into March with a cattle on feed inventory that's a little bit over 1% above this time last year.
9% placements. That's a very high number. I think that surprised a few analysts. Any insight on why that placement number was so high?
Well, yeah, you know, it is a big number, and I think it's a case of the feedlots sort of, borrowing against the future, if you will, and they've been aided by dry conditions, certainly in the central and southern plains where we have some winter grazing. Dry conditions have moved those cattle off earlier. We've got higher prices than a year ago. And so I think any producers maybe that were looking at some tightness on hay supplies or concerns about future drought conditions, maybe wanted to go ahead and take advantage of these markets. So we've moved feeder cattle, some big ones as well as lightweight ones, into the feedlots early, and that probably means we'll have less later.
Derrell, those are the numbers nationally. How about for the state of Nebraska? What did you find when you dug into the numbers there?
Well, Nebraska, you know, most of the major feeding states, and Nebraska included, placements were actually up, I think, about 13% in Nebraska. And so, you know, good marketing's number. So Nebraska comes into March with an on-feed total. It's about 3% above a year ago. So, you know, again, kind of emphasizing those national numbers.
One of the big stories continues to be, as we're turning to the spring here, Derrell, the ongoing drought conditions, largely over the west. Here in the state of Nebraska, on the eastern side, we've seen some scattered rain over the past couple of weeks, which brings some relief to some producers, but certainly not all of them. When it comes to this drought concern, especially where you sit there in Oklahoma, what are you hearing from producers? How big of a concern is that right now?
It's a very big concern, you know, here in Oklahoma and across much of the West, and you know, kind of like Nebraska. It depends a little bit on whether you're in eastern Oklahoma. We did get some rain about a week ago in central and eastern Oklahoma, and that was very timely, very helpful for the wheat crop, and also to sort of jumpstart our pasture conditions. But it's very dry still in the west, and you know, even the moisture we got is not going to last very long. So dry conditions is a major concern across the country and for the whole industry, because at this time of the year, if we continue with these dry conditions for another month or two, we're going to see very serious impacts, and you know, really for the rest of the year in terms of forage production and hay production, and we could see some significant you know, herd liquidation being forced on us in the not too distant future.
Big concern as well, where you're hinting at there, Derrell, is sourcing your feed when it comes to feeding cattle. Well, what have you heard from producers, some of the considerations they're taking to offset the high feed prices?
You know, there's really no good place to turn, and that's one of the challenges this year. You know, again, a spring drought is horrible because you're coming out of the winter. You've used up most of the hay you had, assuming you had hay. And, you know, then with drought conditions, there's just very little relief. Supplemental feed prices are high. So there's going to be really very few options available to producers. And, you know, again, depending on where you are and exactly how that plays out, we could see decisions that really have to happen very quickly as a result of this at this time of the year.
Derrell, when I talk to livestock analysts, specifically here in the cattle market, I often hear about this spring rally, and a lot of people are still optimistic we'll see a spring rally. Talk about the cattle prices you've seen right now, and do you expect that we'll see one of these rallies come here in the next month or so?
Well, you know, it's a little bit of a question mark right now. Obviously, we've had lots of disruptions and volatility in the markets generally because of the war in Ukraine in particular. So, you know, the lightweight calf market, which tends to peak about this time of the year, right now has a peak that happened earlier. We had some, you know, a little bit of decrease in those markets combined with the grain market impacts and so on. Now they're coming back a little bit. So, you know, it's a real question mark. If we're going to have another chance for a spring peak in the calf market, it's going to have to happen in the next week or two, and we may get there, but it's kind of a little bit of a different situation. I think fed cattle is kind of the same way. We're sort of looking for a little bit of a spring rally here before we run out of gas seasonally. We may get it, but there's a lot of volatility in these markets, really coming from the grain side and these input markets. And so it's a bit of a question mark, but we're kind of sort of trying to make one more run at it.
Derrell, as we wrap up our conversation today, any piece of marketing advice you want to leave our viewers with today?
Well, again, we've talked about these high input prices, and I think that's the challenge for cattle producers generally this year. We've got higher cattle prices across the board right now, and we're expecting that to continue. We're trending higher. We may see, in general, the highest prices of the year in the last part of the year, at least very close to it. So the price side is not so much the issue. I think the challenge for producers across the board is going to be managing the cost side, managing, to the extent you need fertilizer, or obviously feed costs are going to be higher, energy prices are higher. That's going to be the challenge for producers in terms of sort of managing the opportunity for profitability this year.